I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Omni viewer, and welcome to Omni at the Movies. Been a while since I've done one of these, hasn't it? Well, today I am reviewing Death on the Nile, the sequel to 2017's Murder on the Orient Express. Now, if you watched the video I released earlier this week comparing the 2017 Orient Express to the 1974 Orient Express, you'll know my thoughts on both films. I actually happen to like both of them immensely. 1974 film is an undisputed classic as far as I'm concerned. Great cast, great cinematography, great music, great writing. I mean, it had a good source, of course, Agatha Christie's original novel, but the way it was adapted was just so good. So when I heard that it was going to be remade by Kenneth Branagh, I was thinking, well, the original is such a classic, anyone would have a hard time living up to it. Even with Kenneth Branagh on both sides of the camera, and I'm a fan of Kenneth Branagh, I love his Shakespeare adaptations, but even with him on both sides of the camera, playing the lead and directing and everything, even he's gonna have a hard time, I thought. But I left the theater after seeing it thinking, he did it. He managed to pull it off. He put a different spin on the story, of course, but it was a good spin. It worked. It allowed us to see Poirot in a slightly different way, but not in a way that betrayed Agatha Christie's original vision. And so I think that both of those movies can exist side by side. Now, of course, we have the sequel, Death on the Nile, and it too is actually a remake. Yes, Death on the Nile was already made as a sequel to Orient Express back in the 70s, although Albert Finney didn't want to come back because he found the makeup to play Poirot uncomfortable, so instead the role was given to Peter Ustinov, who would play him for several other appearances after that. And while I don't necessarily think Death on the Nile is as iconic as Murder on the Orient Express, in the original version I'm talking about here, I do think that original adaptation is still really, really good. The on-location filming that captures Egypt so splendidly, the writing was still sticking close to the source material, but streamlined it just a little bit, and it plays out as well as you can expect. And yes, Ustinov's version of Poirot was different than Finney's, but I wouldn't call it bad. I would say he did a good job making the role his own. So I had rewatched the original Death on the Nile prior to going to see the remake because I wanted to have it fresh in my mind for comparison, kind of like what I did with Orient Express. Now, okay, enough stalling. On to my thoughts on Branagh's version of Death on the Nile. I mean, it's a good movie, but I don't like it as much as Orient Express. The positive stuff I can say is that, as you would expect from a Kenneth Branagh film, it looks amazing. Even knowing that certain liberties were taken with where things in Egypt are located, like if you were to go by this film, every major Egyptian landmark is apparently right on the shores of the Nile River. Even with that in mind, the film still looks great. The Karnak, which is the steamship that they take down the river, that looks great. All the hotel settings and interiors of the ship look great. The Egyptian monuments look great. There's even something interesting the movie did that I'm kind of surprised Orient Express didn't do. Orient Express, Branagh's version, introduced the idea that Poirot has a form of OCD that manifests as a need for symmetry, a need for balance between anything, and imbalance just greatly upsets him. And that was incorporated into the story quite nicely. Unfortunately, it's not incorporated as well here. Like, we see it a couple of times, but it doesn't really factor into the plot. Yet the cinematography has a lot, and I mean a lot of shots in it that are framed symmetrically. Like, the scenes are balanced. You can draw a line and they mirror each other, and I thought that is actually a really nice touch. If that's something you're going to add to Poirot's character, that is a nice way to visually represent it. And for as much as I wish Orient Express had done something like that, I also can't really think of how they would have done it given the setting, because the interior of a train doesn't really give you much to work with in that regard. But anyway, that was a neat little thing I noticed. The cast, of course, is amazing. It's star-studded and nobody's giving a bad performance here. The music serves the story well. It doesn't necessarily have any really instantly recognizable themes like you would expect from something like a Star Wars movie, but the music does a good enough job. Poirot's mustache is toned down just a little bit, but it's still really extravagant. And gee, I guess that's all I can really come up with. I'm sure there's more that I like, but unfortunately I just don't know if this one stuck the landing. First and foremost, while Orient Express stuck fairly close to the plot of the original book, this adaptation of Death on the Nile takes a lot of liberties. The cast is extremely streamlined, even more so than the original adaptation. So certain characters are smashed together, some are just dropped entirely, and also, well, there are subplots added. Due to the multicultural way in which the movie is cast, which Branagh has always done with his movies, but due to that, and due to how it's still set in the 1930s, where seeing a mixture of this particular type would not have been actually that common, because of cultural reasons, of course, a lot of stuff is added to justify why all of these different people from all these different walks of life are all together and all know each other. But also, there winds up being a subplot, a romantic subplot, in fact, that honestly kind of interrupts the movie. An effort was made to incorporate it. You can see how they were building to it throughout, right up to the point where you reveal that there actually was a subplot even going on, and yet it just doesn't feel like it's a natural part of the story, because it's not. It wasn't in the original story. So that's a big strike against it, because the plot is moving along at a steady pace until it suddenly slams the brakes and goes, wait a minute, we got to resolve this thing first. Bet you didn't know there was something else going on, but it has nothing to do with the murders. And yeah, that's just sort of an unfortunate effect. But unfortunately, I also can't say it's the only issue. Other liberties that are taken involve how the different characters wind up interacting with the plot. Because like I said, the cast has been altered, streamlined, cast with different kinds of people, so certain other things have to be introduced in order to make it all work, and that winds up sending certain aspects of the plot in a different direction, where if you know the story, if you know the original version of it, it kind of throws things a little out of whack. And even if you don't know the original story, you might still look at this and think, I'm not sure it's all really adding up the way they think it is. It still gets to the same conclusion ultimately, but it just doesn't feel like it gets there as efficiently or in as convincing a way. So, plus, you know, the emphasis isn't really on the mystery this time around. Not much time is spent building it up, nor is much time devoted to actually treating it like a proper mystery. You watch the original movie, for example, or you read the original book, and the mystery is the main focus. It's a whodunit, and everyone's a suspect. We're following Poirot along as he's doing the investigation. And also, time is taken at the beginning to really show the build-up to the main event. It takes a while for the eponymous death on the Nile to actually happen, but that's because we need to establish why it happens. We need to set up every single suspect and let the audience know why each of these people who would want to do in the victim. Even though you also have to accept the contrivance that all of these people somehow wind up in the same place at the same time, and it's not for the same reason as they would in Orient Express. But all the same, that's just something that's easy to accept because the story itself is still very intriguing. But that sort of thing isn't done in this version. In fact, the different suspects are all basically introduced by way of just putting them all in the same room and having Book tell Poirot, oh, that person is so-and-so who has such and such a relationship, and these people know her this way and that way. Like that. It's not as interesting, and it doesn't really... It's breaking the show don't tell rule. I'll just say it that way. It's telling us all this different stuff, whereas the original versions of the story showed it to us. And I feel like that's more effective. But there's an even bigger issue. An issue that has to do with Poirot himself. In the original Agatha Christie novels, very little was ever revealed about Poirot's past. Poirot was already an old man by the time we get to the stories set in the 1930s. He's already been through a lot. He's semi-retired, even though he's still doing detective stuff. And we never really learn that much about him. Little details are dropped here and there, just enough to keep him interesting. But Poirot is an enigma. And he prefers it that way. He's not the sort of person who is going to open up like that. And it kind of works, because it's interesting to see how the man solving the mystery is himself a mystery. It's a neat little thing. And Poirot is still interesting just from what we know of him as we watch him go through the process. We don't necessarily need to know that much about his past. The hints we get make him feel more like a properly fleshed out character, but we never actually got the full backstory on him. The original set of films that came along stuck to that idea. They also didn't have Poirot reveal too much. We still went with the idea that he was already established, already old, already semi-retired, and people know him by reputation, certainly. But all the same, the main focus is not on who is Poirot, the focus is on who done it. Branagh's adaptation of Orient Express altered that just a little bit by allowing us to see a tiny glimpse of what Poirot was like in private, and give us just a little bit more of a hint about his past. And again, I think it worked in that film. It was just opening the window far enough that we could see more inside than we could see before, but it still kept the window closed for most of the time. And that made Poirot feel like more of a human character, which was the intent. Now, I won't get into spoilers here, but Death on the Nile, the Branagh version of Death on the Nile that I am currently reviewing, it goes full bore into Poirot's backstory. It opens with a flashback to a major event in Poirot's youth, and for the rest of the film, Poirot is revealing more and more about his backstory, his relationships. He's letting his emotions drive him just a little bit more. And it kind of feels like it was a little too much, certainly too much too soon. Like, I don't think it would have been that big of a deal if we'd had more Poirot movies and each one had parceled out just a little bit more information at a time until we finally reached a particular case where we were ready to learn the full extent of who Poirot is. But for just the second movie, it hits you like a truck. And it doesn't feel like it's really earned. Like, it doesn't... I just don't know if it was really that well incorporated into the proceedings. Sometimes it feels like Poirot is way too loose-lipped about his past, which again isn't typical for the character. As few times as he's been adapted, at least that much has been consistent among the different adaptations we do have. However, it goes a little beyond just revealing more about Poirot than has ever been revealed before. The movie also seems like it's attempting to deconstruct Poirot. And it's bordering on that area where, even though you say deconstruction, what you actually mean is, we don't like this and we're going to tear it down. It's bordering on it. Like, given that's been a trend of different movies as of late to tear down the hero, or deconstruct as people prefer to say, it's not the most egregious example I've seen, but it still does the trick. There are moments of Poirot having people tell him to his face what a horrible person he is. He never gets a chance to actually respond, and by the end he's basically going, yeah, this is who I am. I'm still going to reveal who the murderer is, though. And it doesn't feel right. Even more so than revealing so much about his backstory, it still doesn't quite feel right. Deconstructing the hero this soon. And it's done to such an extent that if they do make a sequel, which who knows if they will, but if a sequel does get made, I'm not entirely sure where else you can go with the character from here. In a lot of ways, it feels like this is a final Poirot case. Like it was designed to be the event that takes him out of the game, especially the way it ends, which again, I won't spoil it, but it kind of feels like that's what it was building to. It doesn't quite get to the extent that it says it outright hates Poirot, but I do get the feeling that the movie's not too fond of him either. Which, that just doesn't sit well with me. I don't, I've said in the past that we don't really have that many adaptations of Poirot. Adaptations of other characters, like Sherlock Holmes is everywhere. He's one of the most adapted characters of all time. He's had so many different variations that if there's a particularly bad one, you can just sort of say, well, we can brush that aside because it won't necessarily have that big of an impact on things. But Poirot doesn't have that same luxury. He's only been adapted a handful of times. And even with those adaptations in mind, he's still not necessarily as well known as other characters are. So this could potentially be people's introduction to Poirot. And to have him get sort of taken down a few pegs like this, it never comes right out and says he's a bad detective, of course. Death on the Nile is traditionally one of those cases where Poirot is thrown off from the first iteration, and he has to come back around to the final solution in order to get it right. But, I don't know. It's not... I just wonder what Agatha Christie would have thought of this one. I wonder if she would have looked at this and thought, no, they did too much. They flew too close to the sun. Which is too bad. Because again, I enjoyed Branagh's version of Orient Express. Had it been further in that direction, like if it had actually built on what was in Orient Express more, and felt like a natural extension of what that movie was doing, maybe this would have been better. As such, this feels like too much, too soon, delivered way too quickly. It's not a bad film, again. It's very well made, it's got a lot of good traits to it, but the problems with it are big, big problems. So, if this winds up being the last Poirot movie, at least in this particular series, I wouldn't necessarily be that surprised, and I'm not happy about saying that, because like I said, I'm a fan of Kenneth Branagh. I like the way he does things. I liked what he did with Poirot and the Murder on the Orient Express. I don't know. I was in a very, very empty theater when I saw this one. I'm not surprised, again, because the movie's been delayed so many times and it hasn't really gotten that much in the way of advertising, but, well, I don't see this one being especially well-liked. If there's a sequel, I hope there's improvement, but again, I'm not really sure how they could do a sequel after where they take the character. So, yeah, that's all I really have to say about this one. Wish I could have said more that was positive, but I just can't. So, there you have it. Case closed. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books: Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.